All right. Welcome to the Clayton Tyner podcast. This is episode 11. Today we're talking about the science of story. I'm really excited about today because this is our second time having a guest on the podcast. Many of you will know John Witte if you've been following our work at MetaChurch. For those of you who are unfamiliar with my actual job as the pastor of MetaChurch, this may be a real treat because you may be meeting John Witte for the first time today. Before we jump into it, you guys make sure that you're helping the podcast along. If you're on YouTube, do the trifecta. That's like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. If you're listening only, make sure you're subscribed to this podcast. You can also follow me at Clayton Tyner on Instagram or on Twitter. Today, we're talking about the science of story, and not just a story that you'll read in a book or watch on a movie, observe at a play. We're going to be talking about the story of your life. And maybe that doesn't sound like the most interesting topic in the world, but just give us a few minutes because you might learn something today that revolutionizes who you are and who you are becoming as you move forward. I wanted to give you a chance to get oriented a little bit with John Witte and the work that he does at Wise Counsel. Now, he recently rebranded his business to Wise Counsel, which is a great name. Originally, it was called the Istoria Project. So you're going to see that name come up a little bit from time to time. But before I bring John in, I'm going to let Digital John actually introduce the work that he does with people's stories.
Have you ever wondered why you do the things you do? Why do you spend yourself into crushing debt? Why can't you put down your phone and engage over dinner? Why do you exhaust yourself to gain the approval of others? For 3 decades, I couldn't answer these questions. We don't know why we do the things we do, but we can. Here's how. Our lives are a story. If we can understand story, we can understand life. The science of story, based on the thinking of Aristotle and Homer and formalized by Gustav Freitag in 1863, sheds light on why we do the things we do. The narrative arc shows that for a story to work, we must grow through the challenge of conflict and pain caused by an inciting incident. But since most of us don't like to struggle, avoiding pain drives our decisions. However, few of us realize this. Avoiding the pain of your inciting incident is the reason you married who you did, why you took your last job, and why you can't say no when you should. Yet most of us are simply unaware of the role that our inciting incident plays to turn us into villains or victims rather than the heroes we long to become. So how can you change that? A deep dive into your story is the way to understand how you got to where you are and how to move your life forward.
There are so many key words in there that we're going to be unpacking during our time on the podcast today. Victim, villain, inciting incident. That might not mean anything to you yet, but it will as we move along. And so without further ado, I'm going to bring in Mr. John Witte. John, how are you today, man?
Hey, Clayton. Yeah, I'm doing fine. Thank you. How are you?
Yeah, doing great. I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. Thank you for your time today. Just a little bit of backstory here. John and I worked together at a church in San Antonio for 6 or 7 years at least. And he was a mentor to me. He taught me the basics of preaching. He taught me a ton about leadership. He is currently an overseer of MetaChurch, where I am the pastor, which means he is obligated to answer the phone when I call him when I need help, or ironically enough, I call him when I need wise counsel. That's the name of his business, and that is actually one of the big things that he provides for my life. And through his work at Wise Counsel, his business, he has impacted so many people's lives and so many people's stories. And so, John, man, thanks so much for jumping on a little bit today. I first wanted to just ask, when did you begin to understand the significance of story?
Yeah, Clayton, I was mentored by a guy who was a graduate from Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Dave Anderson. And after I had gotten out of seminary, I was in my early 30s, and I wasn't doing real great in ministry. And so Dave took me under his wing and he mentored me for 3 years, but he mentored me in the system that he had learned which to this day I have a great appreciation for, but it wasn't a story-based system. So when Linda and I went to East Africa as missionaries, I went with this very theological, word-based, conceptual approach to both the biblical text and to preaching and to ministry. And while I was there, I realized that I wasn't doing a great job of connecting with the Kenyans that I was working with. And it was during that time that a guy came from the Philippines who was working on a doctor's degree through Southwestern Seminary. And he was the one, Jim Slack, who first exposed a bunch of us to the idea of story. And I began, Clayton, to immediately try to implement that in my communication. And I was pretty astounded at how well it worked. And we just started effectively telling the stories of Scripture to people. And it was just amazing how much they enjoyed it and got out of it as we told the story of Jesus beginning in Genesis, working all the way through the New Testament. And so that's where I first saw the power of story as a communication tool.
So when was it that you began to see story not just as a way to interpret and communicate Scripture or to appreciate the great stories that already exist for us, but to actually see the power of your life as a story?
Yeah. So what happened to me, Clayton, is during those times, I was in my late 30s at this point in life. And I knew there was stuff wrong with my life, but I couldn't figure out why. I grew up in a really solid family, parents who loved me, had a lot of opportunities. And I couldn't quite figure my life out. Linda and I were living on the Kenya-Tanzania border. We were in the bush. We lived in a beautiful place at the foot of Mount Oldonyo Orok. We were off the grid. It was Linda's absolute favorite place that we ever lived in the 17 years that we served in East Africa. It was one of my least favorite places. And I knew there was something wrong about my life, but I couldn't figure it out. And I was quite frustrated over the fact that I couldn't figure it out. I felt like I should have been able to. Well, that lasted for about 15 years, Clayton. And I never connected the fact that my life story was also a product of just the story template as a whole. And it was while we were working together at church in San Antonio that I began to make the connection between life as a story and just what I'd learned about Freitags Pyramid. Donald Miller actually helped me with that. I listened to some of his stuff, and I read a book, A Million Miles in 1,000 Years. And that book is all about, if you don't like your life story, you can edit it. And I realized from reading that book that it just helped me to recognize the connection between people's life stories, my life story, and just the story template that I call the narrative arc or Freitags Pyramid. And so it was when I first came, to work in San Antonio, I went through a process that really helped me look at my life, not as a story, but just as some individual episodes in it. I saw some patterns in my life. And then when I read Miller's book, it really helped me connect those two things in my mind. And I started sharing this with some of the people that I worked with. And one of the guys just loved it. And he was actually the first guy who said, Witte, we could take this, and when we're counseling with people who come to see us, we could actually draw their life out as Freitags Pyramid. And that was actually Mike Ovieto's idea. And I didn't come up with it. He did. And he was actually the first one to try it and had good success with it. And so I started like copying Mike, using my own stuff, but he was the one who stepped out in it first. And then if you came to see me as a counselor, you just got ready because I was going to take you through your life story. And so it was at that point that I began to see how effective it was for myself and for others, and just on a consistent basis, people understand why they were having the problems they were having, why they were doing the things they were doing. And this whole thing that has become wise counsel based on Freitags Pyramid really took off during those years.
Yeah, it's interesting how it developed because I believe you were in your early 50s the first time you really intentionally went back through your own story. Is that right?
Yeah, it was. I was 52. So imagine being on that Kenya-Tanzania border in my late 30s, and it's about 15 years later when I finally came to realize what my inciting incident was. So the way that happened is we had Fridays off, and it was September, and I'm a hunter. Don't mean any offense to anybody who might not be, but I am. And it was bow season was coming up here in Texas in October. So I was practicing a lot, getting ready for that. And one Friday morning, I was so excited to go outside and shoot my bow. And I had it in hand walking out of the house. And as I walked through the front door of my house to shoot my bow to practice, I had this idea that just passed through my mind, and it was very literally, Witte, you ought to graph your story. And I'd never graphed my story. I'd never told anybody else to graph their story on Freitags Pyramid. But it was like, nah, I want to shoot my bow. And Clayton, physically, I literally started out the door a second time. And again, I had this thought, Witte, you ought to graph your story. Well, Clayton, even though I was a pastor, I never considered myself to be the most spiritual pastor that anyone knew. But even I could sort of figure out, this could be sort of an idea prompting from the Spirit of God to do this. And so I set my bow down. I went and sat down at the table. I was the only person in the house. And within 10 minutes, I knew my inciting incident. And because of the work I had previously done looking at my own life story, all of a sudden, my whole life just sort of fell into place. And I mean, it was like I understood myself and why I had done the things I had done. And that was the beginning of realizing how powerful it was and how this could help people understand how to make their life work. Because now my life made sense. It didn't mean it was good. It just, I understood it, and now I was able to do something about it.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I don't know how I've never thought of this, but you went to Africa and you became quite an expert in understanding story. And when you came back, you had a significant foundation to then translate it into actually understanding your own story. And we're using some words that I want to make sure we get people caught up on. And I think the first is Freitags Pyramid, because this is kind of the key when you're talking about graphing out your own lived experience as a story. The way that you are doing this is on Freitags Pyramid. So what is a Freitag? And I know this, if you're listening only, we actually have Freitags Pyramid pulled up. You can find it very easily. There's a good chance you learned it in freshman or sophomore year English. You've just forgotten it at this point. But it's a very common way to what it is. It's not a way to structure story. It is the way story is structured. Is that an appropriate way to say it?
Yeah, that's exactly the correct way to say it. So the Freitags Pyramid is named that because a guy named Gustav Freytag in 1863, he's the one who drew this out and gave these names to it. But actually what he was doing is he was formalizing the thinking of Horace, who was a Roman poet that lived around 6 BC. So he was older than Jesus, but he was a contemporary in the sense that during this same time in Western civilization, Horace was thinking this about how story works. The first guy in Western civilization to ever formally really say anything about how story functions was Aristotle. And he said that a story had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that seems fairly obvious, but it's actually helpful to recognize we're at the beginning of the story, we're in the middle of the story, we're at the end of the story. And he did that around 350 BC. But then Horace came along and he said, no, I think story actually has more like 5 real defining moving parts to it. And so Horace's ideas held sway in Western civilization from, for around 1800 years until Freytag actually formalized it in 1863. And it has remained the template for how story works. And so what happened to me is, and it's why we call it the science of story, really beginning with Aristotle, if you think about it, till today, we're at almost 2,500 years of consistent thinking about how stories work in Western civilization. And so I don't believe, this isn't something I came up with, Clayton. It's outside my disciplines. It's outside the study that I did formally. I was never, other than being exposed to it like everyone else was, I wouldn't have considered myself any kind of expert in this, but it is how story works. And so I think we're safe to call it the science of story based on the history and how long it has stood the test of time. So if you watch a movie, it's based on Freitags Pyramid. If you read a novel, it's based on Freitags Pyramid. All stories are based on that. And really, Clayton, the reason a lot of people may not care about this, but there might be 1 or 2 people out there who will. The reason I say that your life is a story. So if you can understand how story works, you can understand how your life works. Well, we know how story works. It works like Freitags Pyramid says it works. Every story shares that line, which is kind of that triangle. Everyone shares that line in common. Every single one of us shares that in common. Now, the content of what goes around it, that's different for every one of us. That's what makes you a unique individual. And it's why you have something unique to offer to the world. And it's why we need everyone to offer what they have to offer, because you're a unique person. But we also share Freitags Pyramid in common. And so I say, based on that life is a story. And the reason I say that, Clayton, is that life happens and story happens at some point in time, at some place. When you introduce characters into time and place, you have a story. Well, I believe in the Big Bang. I think that's whenever time and place and matter were created. I think that's when we had place and time functioning. And because of the Big Bang, once you enter and put into that characters, you have story. That's my basis for saying that life is a story. If we can understand how story works, I base that on Freitags Pyramid. We do understand how story works. It works like this picture says. It starts with what he calls exposition. We call that, in the Hysteria process, we just call that your equilibrium. You're born into some kind of a situation. Essentially, it's the context for the story. It's our families, actually, in terms of human beings. It's your mother and father and the family you were born into. Then there's an inciting incident. That is an event that causes some kind of a traumatic effect for you. Doesn't have to be a super traumatic event, although it can be. But what it does is it causes us to lose our sense of security and significance. Then that leads to rising action, or what we call chaos, until finally you reach a climactic moment in your life where you say, I can't do this anymore. Something in my life has to change, or I just don't want to go on like this. And then what he calls falling action, we call it resolution to the chaos and the pain of your past, until you reach resolution, or a new equilibrium where you live as a hero as opposed to living as a victim or a villain. And so that is how fundamentally story works. And when you watch a movie, you're watching a character who goes through these events, and passes through these. When you're living your life story, you're also passing through them. And so what we try to do, Clayton, is we try to help people understand how story works so that they can understand how their life works as a story. And if you can understand how your life works, then I think you have a better chance of making your life work. And Clayton, I think most of us, we might not say it this way, but if we'd be honest with ourselves, what we really wish for every day is we just wish we could get up and our life would work. We wish it weren't broken. We wish it made sense. We wish we understood it. And I think Freitags Pyramid actually helps us do that. And so that's what we do at Wise Counsel, is try to help people understand how to make their life work.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of my experiences in pastoring and counseling people is most people are living, they might not say it this way, but they're living with the idea that they are the star of the movie that is life. You know, they are the main character in the drama that is unfolding. At the same time, when our lives get stuck, and all of our lives get stuck, the idea is no one understands what I'm going through. A lot of people won't accept any kind of help. And, you know, like you were in Africa, you were a missionary over there, which is not for the faint of heart. It's not like every person goes over and lives in you know, very primitive conditions, everyone from the West anyway. You had a great theological education. I mean, I'll say this while we're here, but, you know, Witte, you are the guy that handles the Bible better than anyone else I really personally know. So you have the answers in what we as Christians believe is the answer book for life. You have an amazing wife. You have these great kids. You have mentors. You have everything that you need to figure it out. And yet you're still stuck. And there are parts of your life that you're very frustrated by. And some people go to their death stuck and frustrated by things they just can't figure out in life. And so we think we're the star of the movie. I don't think it's a big sell in 2021 that everyone's life is a story. I think people are beginning to think of their lives as a story. I don't think my generation and younger, I don't think that's a hard sell. The hard sell is because your life is a story and we understand story, we can understand your life. And yes, you are wildly unique, but even the unique aspects of who you are and what you're dealing with fit on a common framework. And if they fit on a common framework, then we have some ways to get to answers that can move you forward.
Yeah.
I think,
yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Clayton.
Well, I want to talk a little bit because the beginning and the end is our equilibrium. And part of how I've understood your initial equilibrium is kind of the idea of innocence, you know, and we all know as parents that one day our children will lose their innocence in a real sense where they no longer are sheltered or protected by us in our homes. You know, they have all of their needs met. At some point, they're going to realize that the world is broken. And is that a good way to introduce like the inciting incident?
Yeah. Let me just say that with regard to making your story work, the reason all of us know that there are things about our life stories that aren't right? We know our life's messed up in some form or fashion. Even if you sort of, you know, think you have life all together, deep down, if you can be honest with yourself or with someone else that you trust in a vulnerable moment, you know, you would probably admit, yeah, this isn't good, and this isn't good, and this isn't good. I got a lot together, but overall, it's not. Or maybe you're like, I really ought to be super happy. You know, I got everything going for me, but I'm not. Something's missing. So we tend to know that, you know, when life's not quite right. Or for some people, they're actually maybe not thinking too much about I'm not right. But what they also know is that not everybody likes you. Some people can't stand you. There's reasons they don't like you. Maybe your spouse actually, you know, feels stuck with you, but they don't really like you. Your kids don't respect you. When they get old enough to leave home, they do. They don't want to be around you. They don't, those are indications that life's not right. You're in debt. You don't know why you spend what you do. You don't know why everybody doesn't think as highly of you as you think of yourself. So what happens to us is most people would, I think, tend to say, yeah, something's not right about my life, but nobody knows why. And so we say, well, I don't know why I do the things I do, or I know I've got this habit that I've tried to change, but I just don't seem to be able to change it. I just keep doing the same thing over and over again, and I don't know why. And what Freitags Pyramid shows us, Clayton, is that an inciting incident did something to you, and that is why you do everything you do. I said that in the initial video, that the reason we do the things we do that we aren't really thrilled about is because of an inciting incident. Well, how do we get to that? Well, you're born into this family. We call it equilibrium in the hysteria process, or formally, Freitags Pyramid calls it exposition. What it really is it's the context for your life setting. So you were born to a mother and a father. For a lot of people, their mother and father in the early years of their life, they are actually physically present. For some, that isn't the case. Their dad typically might have left very early, or maybe the man who fathered you never acted like your dad and never really helped raise you. He wasn't present. He wasn't there. And so the context in which you're born into is this family, typically with a mom and a dad. And if you were born into true equilibrium, that means that things were good. Things were stable. Things were normal. But I know that as people are listening to this podcast, some people are thinking, yeah, there wasn't anything normal in my life early on. There was nothing stable in our family. We weren't born into equilibrium, and that happens to people, right? And so even if maybe you weren't born into that, you were born into a lot of chaos already because your mom and dad were in chaos with each other. They were in conflict with one another. What every child needs is a mother and a father who love each other, because if your mom and dad love each other, then you grow up under this umbrella of their love for one another. And what that does is that helps us feel loved and feel good about ourselves. That's what we all need, Clayton. We all need two things. We all need security and significance. Security is the belief that the people who should love you, want you, and accept you actually do. Now, we don't expect everybody to love, want us, and accept us, but we expect mom and dad to. We hope maybe, our siblings will, maybe grandma and grandpa will, maybe an auntie will, but for sure, we hope that mom and dad, and we expect that mom and dad will love, want us, and accept us. And we get our security from that love, wanting, and acceptance. The other thing we need is significance. And significance is the belief that there is something important and meaningful for you to do with your life, and that you actually have the capacity to do that. And Clayton, where we get our security and our significance is mostly from the equilibrium or the family or the mother and father and their relationship that we're born into. So some of our listeners weren't born into much equilibrium. Mom and dad hated each other. Maybe they divorced shortly after they were born or something like that. Even if, though, you were born into a really solid family, say like I was, there is still going to be an event called an inciting incident. Normally, Clayton, this happens to us between the ages of 5 and 7. And I don't say that because it's a part of a psychological theory. I say it because it's around age 5 that you actually become conscious of yourself as an individual in the world. And as soon as you become conscious of yourself, that's why you're able to remember, I can start remembering my own story around the age 5. That's very typical. Some people are a little earlier, some are a little later, but it's common. And we don't live in a perfect world. So we don't live always in a safe world. And that means that sooner than later, and I find in my practice that it's around the ages of 5 to 7, an event happens to us, and what it does is it disrupts the equilibrium in our life. It causes us to lose our sense of security or our sense of significance.
Yeah.
And whenever that happens, this causes you to lose your identity. Because Clayton, our identity is made up of our sense of security and significance. And so when we lose our identity, we want to get it back. It's painful whenever we don't feel loved. It's painful when we don't feel significant. I don't feel good enough. I don't feel worthy. I don't feel capable of whatever. I'm not as good as somebody else. I don't compare with others. I'm not as strong as he is. I'm not as smart as she is. I'm not as beautiful or wealthy or whatever. And so when we lose those two things, we lose our sense of who we are. So whether you were born into a really stable family or an unstable family, your inciting incident is going to cause you to lose that. And so what happens in the rising action or the chaos is we go on a journey looking for security and significance. And Clayton, let me just say something that I wish everybody could understand and really grasp hold of. Maybe the first thing is that we are all on a journey for security and significance. And until you find it, and I mean really find it, you will keep searching for those two things. And we often do that at the expense of other people. In terms of story, this is what turns you and me into a villain or a victim. So a villain is a person in search of security and significance who takes from other people rather than giving their life away. They take from others at others' expense for their own sake. This is what a villain is. And if you know a villain or are one, it's easy to see, right? The villain is always the bad guy or the bad girl in the story. A victim is a person who lets others take from them for their benefit. The victim feels like it's for their benefit, but they let others take from them in order to try to make their life work. And a victim either just lets everybody take from them, or a victim feels entitled. Because they're a victim, they feel entitled to be given to, because I've been victimized. And the truth about that is that at your inciting incident, every one of us are victimized by someone else who is usually a villain in our lives. So you have been victimized. Then the question is, what am I going to do about that? And so in the rising action, what we start doing is we start trying to mitigate the pain, push the pain away, keep the pain away from the loss of security and significance. We try to do that through what we call our worst ways. And those three common worst ways are addictions to escape the pain of our inciting incident, multiple relationships kind of crying out, does anyone love me, to try to find security, or a third worst way is performance, where we're trying to convince others or ourselves that we are not inferior, that we are significant because of all the things that we're doing. And Clayton, it is the connection between our addictions, relationships, and performance connected to the pain of our inciting incident. That's why you do the things you do. And when we don't know what our inciting incident is, that's why we don't know why we do the things we do. Most of us know our patterns, but we don't know the cause of them. And the root cause of them is what Freitags Pyramid or story says is your inciting incident.
Yeah, I've heard you say that your inciting incident, it creates kind of a source of primary pain. And so you're going to build your worst ways to escape that pain. And it builds in you a false narrative that begins to build the wrong identity in who you are. And so if we're looking at this pyramid, it feels like most people are living trapped in the tension between this inciting incident that they're probably unaware of and a turn at a climactic moment where they can begin moving towards a new equilibrium. And we're just circling around this chaos. It's so interesting because it's like when I'm stuck in life, I start looking for what is right in front of me to see what the source of it is. What am I doing? What am I not doing? What habits am I in? What relationships am I in? Where's my mental health? Where are my thoughts at? And the reality is, if our life is a story, and this is the way story works, we have to look backwards. We have to go back and discover where this pain and where these false narratives come from. And so what I want to do, Witte, to help, I want to do what helped me. I want you to do what helped me, which is let's talk about a popular story. And what I've heard you do is I've heard you do Lion King before really well, and just how Simba's life fits on here, right?
Great.
So I'm gonna try, and then you can grade me, okay?
Okay.
So we have Simba's equilibrium, and I actually can't remember if I'm right about this or not. But the obvious inciting incident is not just the death of his father, but the false narrative that's given him by Scar, which is that the death of his father is actually his fault. So the equilibrium, it's pretty long, but the story hasn't actually started yet. You get introduced to everybody. Him and Nala are obviously going to be in love someday. They can go everywhere the light touches. Even though he disobeys and has a little adventure, Dad shows up, right? And so you get this dad bond, and then Dad really disciplines him, right? But then he also really loves him. And so, Mufasa is a great dad. He's a good father. And so you get all that set up just to watch Mufasa, get thrown off that freaking cliff and stomped by some wildebeest. Like I was very young when this movie came out, man. This was pretty traumatic, and so he gets a primary source of pain, which is this loss of his father. And he gets this false narrative and grows up, runs off as a victim, I would guess, runs off into, the wilderness, lives with this false narrative that the death of his father, probably the destruction of Pride Rock, all of that is actually his fault. And he lives, even though they do a time lapse, and so you don't see it, but he lives the majority of the movie, of his lifespan in the movie, in the tension, in the rising action, ignoring his responsibilities, abdicating his place on the throne, letting all of his family members back home starve and be taken over by hyenas. I mean, he really screws everybody over because he is just stuck in this tension. And that is, that's equilibrium, inciting incident, tension. And it is all of our lives, in a real sense. Our story starts when our inciting incident occurs.
Yeah. So what happens, Clayton, and in the movie, the way you can summarize his false narrative was with that Kiswahili term, Hakuna Matata, that, life has no worries. And you remember Disney, I mean, they wrote the whole song about it, right? And as he's saying, oh yeah, life has no worries. Well, that's just not true, because back home at Pride Rock, there was nothing to eat, right? Because Scar was in charge. And so they had all kinds of worries, but his friends convinced him that life had no worries, and he grew up believing that and living in a way that his life didn't have any worries. He was ignoring them, avoiding them, and it was at that point that he actually became a villain, where he's eating bugs. Yeah, he's having to do some things that aren't cool for a lion, and certainly not a lion king, but he becomes this villain who ignores his responsibility and just escapes into, this beautiful paradise, but where he has no responsibility and he doesn't take any responsibility because of his false narrative. He believes that he's not capable, he's not worthy of being, the king of the jungle. And his Uncle Scar is the one who convinced him of that. That's one of the things about your false narrative, is that Usually someone else places that false narrative on you. Not always, but certainly in the Lion King movie, Scar puts it on Simba and he believes it. And life can never be right when you believe a false narrative because it's false.
Right.
And so when we're believing that, we're living on false assumptions about who we are and what we're capable of. And he certainly did that.
Yeah, it's he was living in paradise. I mean, they show it in the cartoon, and it's beautiful
Yeah.
and there's waterfalls and everything else. But it's a false paradise. It's not his. Yeah. He didn't earn it. It's not actually fulfilling. And it's the kind of escapism that all of us go to when we're just stuck. We can't figure out life. And so we escape into relationships, or we escape into drugs, or we escape into our performance. And, it reminds me, I grew up thinking the animated Peter Pan was a hero. He fights Captain Hook. The actual Peter Pan story, he's like the mother of all villains, man. He was, I believe he was an orphan, right? So he's got his inciting incident. He ends up in Neverland, and he makes the conscious decision he will not grow up. And that is his tension, is he's abdicating his maturity. He's actually very similar to Simba in the sense that he is choosing to stay in a false sense of paradise to escape his pain. Wendy goes home and grows the heck up, man, and he just leaves her be. He doesn't do anything for her, and he keeps all these lost boys. He keeps them lost. Nobody ever grows up, and that's Woody, I don't know if you're seeing this, man, with the people that you're counseling and stuff, but we have a real problem in the West right now where men are not growing the hell up. It's a huge problem. We have Peter Pan syndrome, and it is significant. And it seems to be a major form of escapism to try and get away from our pain right now, as there's almost no motivation to grow up.
Clayton, I do think in the West right now, at least in the States, a part of the narrative that's being put out there is that men are villains. They can't be trusted. They're the source of all things bad. And the truth is that we're all victims, and we're all villains, and we're all the source of all things bad. Some may have played a very special role in that, and there's no doubt. I mean, history tells us that. There's no question about that. But we all suffer from the same basic problems. And the same general problem that we all suffer from is what Freitag is telling us. We've all experienced a loss of security and significance, and then we do all kinds of things to try to get that back. And it's never good. It never works. And when villains function, they take advantage of victims, and they turn people into victims. And sometimes the victims are able to throw off what the villain has done, and sometimes they're not. Generally, what you're describing with men, it can be true of entire generations. And that is where we refuse to grow up. We refuse to take responsibility for ourselves. And what we're really doing in terms of what we teach in the Asteria process is we're refusing to assume the burden of our purpose in the world. And so Simba, if you think about him in Lion King, it's why the movie's named Lion King. He was born to be king. And his dad, who is king, is preparing him for that. He's loving his son so that Simba has security, and his mother loves him. So he has all this security, and his significance is, son, one day all of this will be yours, kind of thing. You're going to rule over. Well, that's pretty significant. That's pretty heady stuff. And so he's being prepared for that you are loved and you're important, you're significant. There's something important for you to do. And what's happening to boys and girls today, to people, and it's been happening now for decades, really, and so it's kind of becoming generational, is a lot of people aren't growing up with a mom and dad who love them. They don't have a sense of security, so they're looking in multiple relationships for security, and they also don't have a sense of significance, so they don't believe in themselves, and a lot of boys are being taught not to believe in themselves. But we're also shirking, basic identities. I mean, our culture's rejecting that there are certain responsibilities and that we have purposes that go along with that. And so people are not finding a sense of purpose in life, and purpose is the pathway to your potential. So all of that chaos, all that's rising action, that period of chaos, even though this is full of conflict and confusion and it is chaos, it's not wasted. It has to happen. So Simba had to go through what he went through in order to finally meet a guide again who would encourage him to go back and assume his responsibility of living out his purpose. As far as I know, in Peter Pan, he didn't have a guide to do that for him. Maybe I don't remember the story, but I don't remember that he did. And so none of us becomes the hero of our story without a guide who actually helps us deal with the climactic event and resolve the pain of our past and go back and live in it. And when we don't live out our purpose, that's when we live as a victim or a villain in a life of chaos. And so what happens to us, Clayton, is we get to those climactic events in our lives that could help us tip to the right side, the falling action, the resolution. But instead of tipping to the right, we just go back again into the chaos, and we keep making those same decisions over and over again. And it just creates more chaos. And if you are a chaotic person, then everyone's life around you becomes chaotic as well, because that's the kind of person that you are. And so boys are growing up and, maybe they don't have a father figure who really loves them. We know that just from facts and statistics about those that are incarcerated, that usually the huge percentage of those boys don't have a father at home. So they don't have a role model. They don't have anyone who really loves them and can teach them how to be a man. I love what John Eldredge says. He says, femininity cannot confirm masculinity. So in other words, a woman can't make a man out of a boy. Only a man can do that. But for a man to make a boy into a man, that man has to actually be at home. And he's got to love his son, and he's got to love his daughters, and he has to care about them. And Simba had that.
To compound that problem, whether there's a dad at home or not, part of the problem is that all teenagers instinctively think that their parents are idiots, there's no one smarter on earth, than a 15-year-old or whatever.
Right.
And so if you don't have a guide, then by de facto, the culture becomes your guide. And when you look at, I would assume that if we looked generationally, that there would be trends in the worst ways, false narratives among people based on what was being pushed forward by the culture at that time. And right now we're going through another sexual revolution where sex is very transactional. We're very much in a hookup culture right now. And so what that means is men don't have to work for sex. They don't have to have any level of competence for it. They don't have to provide anything. They don't have to make any kind of commitment to anybody. And back when people were choosy about sexual partners, you had possibly the greatest biological incentive to get yourself together, grow up, get out of your dad and mom's basement, get a job, be able to provide and take care of somebody. And because it's just for sale at this point, sex is just for sale. And I think that's worth noting because, pornography, it's been around almost like literally forever, but it's been discouraged almost forever. And now it is seen as something that is empowering. And so there are worst ways that are being celebrated. There are vices that are being promoted as virtues. And no wonder people get stuck in the chaos of the rising action, not able to overcome it when we're calling things that are bad good.
Yeah. So Clayton, just at this point, I want to be sure that our listeners know that I don't have any need to judge anybody for,
Sure.
where they're at. And I know you believe that, feel the same way that I do about that. So this
Yeah.
part of our conversation is not an attempt to judge anyone, including our culture. But let me just say that the reason that in terms of Freitags Pyramid, if we analyze, like, why are a lot of girls willing to give their sexual life away and require nothing of the boy? Well, the reason that that's happening is if you think about who is choosy about their sexual partner, it's someone who typically, and I'm not saying there couldn't be an exception, but exceptions prove the rule, that typically it would be a girl who grew up in a equilibrium where her father and mother loved each other and loved her and taught her that what love is and taught her that she was significant.
Right.
And when a girl grows up knowing that she's loved, particularly by her father, and that her father and mother believe in her and that there's something significant for her to do, well, she's just going to be choosier about almost everything in her life because she has this very healthy self-image about who she is. And that's normal. That's what you were supposed to get. Well, when you don't get that, what ends up happening is the girl is sort of screaming out, "Does anyone love me?" And this boy says, "Yeah, I love you." And, then how are we going to prove that? Well, we're going to prove it the easiest way possible, and that's to have sex with each other. Well, that doesn't prove anything, but it's an escape maybe for him. It's her, trying to find if anyone loves her, or maybe it's an escape for her as well. Pornography is certainly that. It's easy sex. Sex feels good. It's an addiction. It can be an addiction. So, we easily run to that. And because you have a whole generation or generations growing up now who feel very insecure and very insignificant, it explains why we do most of the things we do. It explains our sexual interactions with one another. It explains things as simple as some of the power moves in our culture where, we have a very divided culture politically. And so there's a lot of, power at work there. Well, why? Why does the right always have to win? Why does the left always have to win? Well, one of the reasons we have to win is those are ways that we prove that we're significant and that we're right. And it makes us feel safe and secure when our side wins. And I know it's more complicated than that, but that's a part of why we're so politically divided. Is you have a lot of insecure, insignificant people trying to gain security and significance.
Well, and it's interesting too, because, and again, exactly like you said, I mean, we're all living out a story. We all go through an inciting incident, which means we all have pain. We have a myriad of options of ways to try and escape that pain, numb that pain, ignore that pain, live out our false narratives. And what the culture puts constraints on certainly weighs the scale of what worst ways people go towards. And you put on top of that a technological revolution where everyone is born, I believe, with a deep, deep longing for significance, right? Significance and security. Yeah. Everyone has that. It's at the core of who we are. And so that was hard enough when your social circle was maybe 40 people. It was your family, it was your neighbors, it was your coworkers. If you went to church or a gym or a club, you had 40 people to compare yourself to. Now you have literally everyone on the planet. You're connected to them. People have thousands of Facebook friends. They have thousands of Instagram followers. And so if you want to try to play the comparison game and measure your significance based off of that, man, you are in serious trouble. You're never going to be enough. You're never going to do enough. And, these different aspects of worst ways and means of escape, they're tied into that, and it's all so new. There's no way we actually understand what has happened to us over the last 10 years, the amount of information that we carry in our pockets, the amount of connection and always being on that we carry around with us. And all of that plays in to our stories. And social media is can be one of those very negative guides that every time we get. So the climactic moment, sometimes this is called the rug being pulled out from under you, right? Or the bottom falling out. Or that's some of those climactic moments, right?
Yeah. And Clayton, what happens in a climactic moment, as you can see in the pyramid, is you get to a point in the story where something has to change.
Right.
And if it doesn't change, I can't make my life work. This is just all chaos. And so we finally get to that point where we're willing to resolve the chaos. We're willing to resolve the underlying causes of the chaos, which is your inciting incident. And that's why it's important to actually work through your story and figure out what yours is and what your false narrative is, what it did to you, so that you can resolve it. And there's two levels of resolution. As Christians, we believe that the gospel answers the question about security and significance. Clearly, the core of the gospel is John 3:16, that for God so loved the world, right? He loves you. He loves you like you are. He accepts you as you are. He wants you. He wants to be in a relationship with you. And so the core message of the Christian faith is that the God who made you and designed you and knows the most about you, knows everything about you, wants to be in relationship with you, and that Jesus made it possible for us to be in relationship with him through his substitutionary death on the cross. In other words, he died for us so that we don't have to die. We can live forever. We can live in relationship with our Creator. That's the core of the gospel, and that answers the question of security. Significance is also answered in the gospel in the sense that God loves you as you are, but I like what Andy Stanley says, he loves you too much to leave you as you are. And so he wants to see you become a hero. He wants you to live as the hero of your story. As you said earlier in the podcast in the beginning, we all have this innate desire to be the hero in our story. You were supposed to be the hero in your story because heroes live really good stories. It doesn't mean they live easy stories, but they live good stories. And whenever you and I live as a hero, a person who gives our life away for the benefit of others, even at cost to ourselves, that is the most significant thing you can do. And so when you live out your purpose in life, that's when you reach your potential. That is a significant life. It feels meaningful. It feels purposeful because it is. You were created to do that. And that is the life that benefits the most people. And when you use, Clayton, your life story for the benefit of others, that's what it means to follow Jesus. And so to believe in Jesus is how we experience security. To follow him is how we experience significance. And this is what every one of us is looking for anyway. It's when you reach a climactic event that you finally come to the point where you're ready to hear the gospel and you're ready to follow and live like Jesus, or to live as a hero, to make the most of the rest of your life, to save your life. That's what living as a hero actually is. And it's the most significant life you can live. And it is those two things that we're all looking for. A climactic event brings us to the place in our life where we can actually choose to live in the security and significance that God offers every one of us. And so the way we do that is through a 3-step process. I don't know if you want me to go into that now, but I can briefly, and then you can do whatever you want with it. To resolve all the chaos that comes from your inciting incident, there are three basic steps you have to take. The first step is you have to find the good and the bad. In Christian terms, we call that trust. Can I trust that God had a reason for letting me live this chaotic life story? Why was I born into the family I was? Why did I have the inciting incident I did? Why did I have all these struggles in my life? Because that's how you grow. And Freitags Pyramid actually shows us that part of the triangle that is that climb upward. It's hard, but it also represents growth in our life. And that's what everyone's life story is about, growing. And so, can I trust that God had a reason for all of that? Or if you're not particularly a person who's ready yet to just trust your whole life to God as the creator of the universe, maybe you don't believe that. The other way of asking that is can I find good in the bad? In other words, when I look back at my life story and these hard things that happened to me, what are the good things that have accrued to me because of the struggles that I've lived through? That's the first step of resolution. And a climactic event brings me to the point in life where I'm willing to say, can I find the good in the bad? The second step is based on that. If you can find good from the bad that has happened to you, that forms the basis of taking step 2 to resolve the pain of your past instead of running from it. And that second step is to let the past go so that you can go. The Christian term for that is forgiveness.
Right.
And so what happens to many of us, Clayton, is this pain happens in our past. Somebody does it to us. Maybe my dad did it to me. Maybe a cousin did it to me. Someone else did it to me. And I feel like a victim, and I harbor resentment against those who did that. And this pain, I never want to forgive. I never want to let it go. And so the pain of your past informs every decision you make. And I suggested in that short 90-second video that that's exactly what happens to us. That it affects us so much that it determines who we marry. It determines the jobs we take. It determines everything about us, how I spend my money, how much alcohol I drink, whether I overeat. It determines everything for us, and we don't even realize it. Whenever we have a climactic event, we can see the good and the bad. That sets me up to forgive the person who actually caused it. The way I like to describe it is an inciting incident is when it happens, we put this harness on and we pull this huge boulder around our whole lives, and we don't realize that we're doing it. And it prevents us from reaching our full potential. It's with us 24/7. And letting the past go is dropping the harness and saying, I'm no longer going to live as a villain or a victim. I'm not going to let the pain of my past determine all of my decisions moving forward. I'm going to forgive. I'm going to drop it. I'm going to let it go so that I can go and live my full life. I like the way one friend put it. It's like walking out of prison, hearing the doors slam behind you, taking what you've learned and walking free. And that's what forgiveness does. It allows us to resolve it. And then whenever I still feel that pain from time to time, instead of triggering me back into my worst ways of addictions and relationships and performance, instead, I let that trigger acts of love or acts of kindness, because this is the core of what it means to be a hero, a person who gives their life away for the benefit of others, even at cost to themselves, is a person who cares about others, loves others, is kind toward others. Their motive is to benefit other people. And I think Jesus was the ultimate hero. I think the cross was the ultimate expression of love for the world. And Jesus is the ultimate hero. And that's how he lived his life. And that's what it means to follow him. So to live as a hero in your story is to in my mind, to live like Jesus, particularly if you believe in him. And so those are the 3 steps to resolving the pain of your past. And I think of resolution that follows. It's that downward line in the pyramid. The climactic event sets you up to be able to say, okay, I'm not just going to keep living in these patterns that don't work. I want to resolve my story so I can live as a hero. And that's what has to happen. That's what happened to Simba in Lion, right?
Yeah, I was just about to say that, and I think part of what you're trying to help people understand is there's another side to your story. And when for those of you who are listening, you can actually see this. If you picture a triangle, it's like at the bottom left angle, that's your inciting incident. And until you pass the climax at the top angle, you're only living on the left side of the triangle. That's all you have. You have one side to your story, and it is a side of tension, chaos, worst ways, pain, and false narratives. And you will hit climactic moments. And if you can decide to draw the good out of what has happened to you in life, and there is always good, and if you can decide to let that past go and to use the good things from that pain to now move towards your purpose, you can then go from the top of the triangle down to the right side of it. There is another side to your story. There's another side to life. But if you don't understand where the pain is coming from, and that's, so Simba, he has some good guides. He has Nala, right? Nala shows up and Rafiki in some sense. And then he is reminded from, Mufasa in the clouds, who he is. That was his statement to him. Remember who you are. And, he was abdicating his responsibility. He was refusing to grow up. But baby Simba was a cocky dude, man. He had no humility. He was humbled out there. He learned the value of equality. I mean, he was going to be king, man. Zazu can't talk to him like that. Nala can't pin him. Everyone's beneath him, but now he's lived in a meritocracy out with Timon and Pumbaa. He's learned to value people who he wouldn't have valued before. He's humbled. There is good that has come out of the bad, and he's got this higher purpose. There's obviously the falling action, the path towards resolution. He goes back to Pride Rock, and then the new equilibrium, right? It's the slow motion walk out to Pride Rock, and he roars, and it rains again, and the plants come back, and now he's living in the paradise that he's earned, and the paradise that is actually his, and he's living out his purpose. And that's that's an animated movie, but it is how our lives work as well.
It's a great explanation, and someone might, in theory say, "Oh yeah, I don't want to be, Simba." But in point of fact, most people would love to be Simba. They'd love to be standing there and be king of the jungle or queen of the jungle. But you're designed to be that, and it is your best life. And when Simba takes up his purpose, assumes it, and reaches his potential. And by the way, there's always risk involved in that, because he had to go back and fight his uncle and the hyenas. So there's risk involved in becoming a hero. But when he chose to embrace that risk and embrace his past, learn again from his father who's guiding him, and the witch doctor, right? Because the witch doctor, I mean, this is Disney. This is not a Judeo-Christian movie, but it shows, he goes back. Remember, he teaches him about the past. And he hits him over the head with a stick, and he says, "What's that?" He says, "It's in the past. It doesn't matter." And well, it felt very present, but his point was, you got to let the past go so you can go. I mean, that is the point he was making. And through these guides, he goes back and does that. What happens? Simba isn't the only person who benefits. Everyone benefits when you live out your purpose. Everyone benefits when you redeem the pain of your past. And that's what Simba did in the movie. And that's what every one of us has to do if we want to live as a hero. When you live as a hero, everyone benefits from being in relationship with you. And so you talk about, I just think about it. Clayton, what if in America right now, in our culture, we could get 100 senators and 500 and something Congress people and presidents and former presidents and leaders of tech companies. What if everyone could actually live as a hero for the benefit of others? What if that actually happened? It is how life works. And on a macro scale, it's how society works well. And at the core of it is that you are secure and significant as a person. And as Christians, we believe it's because of a God who made you in his image, and you can then live for the benefit of others. And I can say this, Clayton, I think is really important. Until somebody becomes really stable about their own security and significance, they cannot live as a hero. You will continue to live as a villain or a victim in your story. And when you and I live as villains and victims, and bro, I lived as a villain for 30 years. I mean, the reason my story didn't work on the Matapato, Kenya, Tanzania border is because I was a villain. And I felt like I was being taken advantage of, and I hated it. I didn't like my life then. I didn't know it then, but I know now. I was a villain then. Linda was married to a villain. I mean, she had a hard life being married to me. And so it's just when we live that way, everyone benefits from it, and societies benefit from it as well. And that's why we're looking for heroes today. And we all have the capacity to be one.
Well, it's huge. And, a few things I've seen through this process, and, just for transparency's sake, I've been through this process actually with Witte himself. And it is a actual requirement to be on my staff at MetaChurch that you have to go through this process. You have to understand your story, because your life is a story. And if you want your life to work well, you have to understand story, where it comes from, what your inciting incident is. And the benefits are not just personal, because none of us live on an island. None of us are navigating life alone. And we mentioned earlier, a lot of people, we've grown up in front of televisions. And so we kind of picture ourselves as the main character in the movie, and the problem is we're not the main character, but we are a character, and our actions affect the people around us. And if we want our families to thrive, if we want our kids to thrive, we have to be on a path towards the other side of our story. We have to be parenting as heroes. If we want our marriage to really thrive, we have to be a hero to our spouse. And just such interesting things, because, Witte, I know that you often meet people at the point where they're at or near a climactic moment where something's got to shift. They're near the top of that pyramid, and they're either going to tumble into significant chaos, or they're going to get their life headed towards the right direction. And I was talking about you a couple of weeks ago. I was in conversation with a friend, and they had some people in their friend group who had affairs. And, that's an unfortunately common thing that seems to be happening these days. But they have a great marriage, and they mentioned, I don't know if my spouse cheated, if I could stay with them. And, there's a lot more nuance to that on what the answer is there. There's a lot of nuance we won't be able to get into. But I started talking about this process of understanding story, because one of the keys to being able to stay with someone, whether it's through infidelity, whether you discover a significant addiction, whether they're just a terrible person to be around, part of making that relationship work is if you can understand their story. The moment that you understand someone you care about's inciting incident, and all, like you said, you were going to go shoot your bow, and instead you graphed your story, and it was like all of these parts of your life interlocked and came together, and things made sense about your life that for 50 years hadn't made sense. And I experienced that sitting in your kitchen, going through my own story, all of these things where I just, for 15 years, I've been going, why in the world did I do that? Why did I make that decision? How am I stuck in this habit? It all starts lining up. And when you see that for someone that you care about, or for me, adopting Kimberly out of a terrible situation, and we see the results of the trauma that she's been through. And my hope for Kimberly, and she's just taken these huge strides, and she's a daddy's girl, and she's kind of got me figured out and everything else. But my two pieces of real hope for all of my kids and the trauma that they've been through is, number one, as a Christian, the gospel, and number two is for them to understand their story. And that is my hope for them. Whatever they've been through, whatever damage I do as a very imperfect parent, whatever damage was done to them before I became their parent, whatever they live through in the years to come, is that if they will walk through the process of understanding God's story, the ultimate story, and understanding their story, that there is hope. And I really believe there's hope for anyone who can walk through that process and discover where your pain and where your false narratives are really coming from and what your worst ways are rooted in. It is so powerful. And I hope anyone who listens to this and is stuck with us will take seriously the idea that our lives get stuck and our lives are stories. And if we can understand story, we can understand our life. That is so monumentally huge. And I hope people will pick that up and really understand it.
Yeah, Clayton, I don't know if people believe me. I always used to say to people, they would meet me and think they liked me right away. And I would say, oh, you like me because you don't know me. If you really get to know me, you won't like me near as much as you do. And that's because I knew that, there were things about my life that just weren't heroic, if I can say it that way. As I said, I was a villain for, big 2/3 of my life. Well, I'm 62 and I discovered my inciting incident at 52. And I can just tell you, I pretty much repeated my villain ways until at least I was 52. And I think probably have since then. So out of 6 decades, 5 of them I lived, or 4 of them I lived as a villain for sure. Okay, think about that. My parents are really great parents, but nobody is born as a hero. You become a villain and a victim. When we marry, we don't marry as heroes. We marry as villains and victims. The reason your mom and dad made mistakes, even if they did love you, they still made mistakes. Sometimes your parents didn't love you. They didn't really want you. They didn't accept you. And that's because your mom and dad were villains and victims. And villains and victims tend to attract each other and marry one another, and they become your parents. And we're born into these contexts, these equilibriums, these expositions, as Freitags calls it. And it affects us. And it explains why our parents struggled, and it can help us understand why was my early life at home so difficult. It was because your mom and dad weren't perfect. They were villains and victims when they were having children. That's what happens to all of us. And so it helps us understand. It helps us be able to forgive. It helps us be able to appreciate our mom and dad, to appreciate the people in our lives. It helps us have hope, not only for our own story, but for the stories of our children and the people that we're associated with. And so, hope is a big word for us in Judeo-Christian tradition, right? Hope is this huge sense that something is coming that is better, that is good, that is right, that is perfect. And it's a major motivation to live well today. And I think whenever we take the time and spend the money and the effort to actually go through our life story, or to go through that with you guys in Starting Point at MetaChurch, I just think it gives us a sense of hope that our lives can work, and they can work. You have to go through chaos. It's not by chance that you went through it. It just has to be redeemed. And I think that's what God wants to do. I think that's why Jesus died, is to redeem our lives. So I like what one friend said. She said, after the gospel, this is what everyone else needs. Everyone else needs to go through this process. And if possible, it's a luxury, but if possible, I do think that's true for the very reasons you just said.
I agree. And, I've recommended that people go to certain doctors, chiropractor. Hey, you got to go see this movie. It was the greatest. And, sometimes people come back and agree, and sometimes they disagree. I've never sent someone to go through this process who didn't come back with their life changed, actually changed. And or maybe the better thing to say is they came back confident they had the tools in their toolbox to begin to see their life change. They had certainly a changed perspective on their life. We have 20-something people going through this process at MetaChurch right now. The stories that are coming out of it are unbelievable. You know, Pastor Tony has just dove in headfirst on all this and is really doing a great job. For me and Katie, you know, it was so significant for us to have this shared language and shared understanding, not just about who we are and who we're becoming, but about who we were and where we came from, which has shaped us every step of the way. As an employer, you know, you look at people who are struggling sometimes in their jobs. As a employee, you look at your coworkers who you just think are idiots or the most frustrating people. And once you go through this, it's hard to not go, they're living out a story. And I don't know what that story is. And I love what you said about politics, because we're so polarized. And if we could just give people the benefit of the doubt that we wish they would give us, it really would. It would actually change everything. I did an episode on polarized politics here on the podcast, because it's we're in a place where it's no longer you versus me and we disagree. It's you versus me and you're evil. It's good versus evil in everybody's opinion. And the reality is we're all dealing with evil. We're all dealing with chaos. We're all living in the tension of a broken world. There is another side to our stories, but we have to understand our story to get there. And so, man, for those of you listening, I really hope that this made sense to you, that you take it to heart. What John shared with us today is one of those things that if you can really grasp it, it will be so significant to you and for your life, for the people in your life. You can learn more about what Witte does by going to istoriaproject.org. That's ISTORIA project.org. Again, they're now doing business as Wise Counsel, but the website is still istoriaproject.org. You guys can check that out. I want to thank you, John, just for coming on here, for giving almost an hour and a half of your time. This has been so fun for me, so enjoyable. Your wisdom is more valuable than you could imagine, and we'll have to do it again sometime.
Thank you, Clayton. I've enjoyed being with you. Love what you're doing, and thank you for having me on.
Awesome. All right. Those of you who are watching or listening, make sure you are subscribed. Share this with your friends. Use your voice. If this is helpful to you, it might be helpful for others. We're going to be back at it next week. Love you guys. Hope to see you there.